in pursuit of health and wisdom. Sapio with Buck Joffrey.
Welcome back to Sapio. This is Buck Joffrey. Today, my guest on Sapio is Dr. Nathan S. Bryan. He is a leading expert in molecular medicine and nitric oxide biochemistry. He's got a PhD from Louisiana State University, and he's made groundbreaking discoveries in the role of nitric oxide in human health, particularly cardiovascular function. He was the first to describe nitrite and nitrate as essential nutrients for optimal cardiovascular health and discovered an endocrine function of nitric oxide. His work has led to patents and development of methods to restore nitric oxide in humans. And as a researcher, author, and entrepreneur, Dr. Bryan continues to be influential in advancing nitric oxide research and its applications in human health. Thanks so much for joining.
Thanks for having me. It's great to see you.
Yeah, so lots of interesting stuff to talk about here. But I think the first thing might be useful to do is just to kind of set the stage and the big picture. I mean, obviously, there are non-scientists and non-physicians listening as well, although we do tend to get into the weeds here. But let's talk about the role overall of nitric oxide in normal human physiology.
Well, in the late 70s, early 80s, there was a discovery that there's a molecule that's naturally produced in the cells that line the blood vessels, the endothelial cells, that causes these blood vessels to relax and dilate. And this was once called endothelium-derived relaxing factor, meaning that the endothelium produces a substance that causes blood vessels to relax. And later on in 1987, this was discovered to be nitric oxide gas. So nitric oxide is a gas. It's naturally produced inside the body of all mammals, in fact, most life forms. And it regulates blood flow, oxygen delivery, controls tissue oxygenation. So that was how it was first discovered. And then a Nobel Prize was awarded in 1998 for the discovery of nitric oxide as a signaling molecule in the cardiovascular system. But now fast forward, 20, 30 years, we understand that it's a ubiquitous molecule, meaning that it not only controls oxygen delivery, controls blood pressure and sexual function, but it mobilizes stem cells. It leads to repair and replacement of cells. It improves mitochondrial function, so the production of cellular energy is dependent upon adequate nitric oxide production. And more recently, it's discovered that nitric oxide is what controls telomerase, the enzyme that prevents our telomeres from shortening. So I think, in a nutshell, it's really the holy grail of longevity and anti-aging medicine, because when you lose the ability to produce nitric oxide, that's now recognized as the earliest event in the onset and progression of most, and I think all, age-related chronic disease.
That's fascinating. I want to focus first on age-related decline in nitric oxide leading to or contributing to the pathogenesis of, say, cardiovascular disease in particular. Describe this a little bit more. Obviously, we know from the research that's out there and what you've told us that nitric oxide is really critical in terms of blood vessel dilation, ultimately providing blood flow to the end organs, including the heart. We've basically got decline of this as we age. What do we know about that process of decline?
Well, we have to understand the enzymology and the biochemistry of the enzyme that makes nitric oxide in the lining of the blood vessel. And so what we find, and you made a good point here, the older we get, if you look at population-based studies that, age through decades, that we see this age-related decline in the function of this enzyme. And so all these experiments are conducted using an agonist like bradykinin and acetylcholine, endothelial agonist, that then stimulate and activate the enzyme. You get nitric oxide being produced, and you can see resultant vasodilation. So when we look at endothelial function, which is really a measure of the ability of the cells to make nitric oxide, that declines with age. And what we found is that the enzyme, the nitric oxide synthase enzyme in the endothelial cells becomes uncoupled. And usually this is due to oxidative stress. So you oxidize a molecule called tetrahydrobiopterin, leads to NOS uncoupling, and you no longer can make nitric oxide. Because this is getting into a little bit of the weeds here.
Sure.
5-electron multi-step oxidation of an amino acid called L-arginine. So we're never deficient in arginine. We've lost the ability to convert that amino acid into nitric oxide. And it's really the Western lifestyle, right? It's inflammatory diet, it's exposure to toxins, it's a sedentary lifestyle, it's a lot of pharmaceutical medication that many patients are on that lead to endothelial dysfunction. So to make a long story short, we understand what leads to NOS uncoupling and nitric oxide deficiency. We understand now how to recouple the NOS enzyme. And now we know how to prevent this age-related decline in nitric oxide production.
Well, we should probably jump to that then. How do it's probably not worth talking about this, but you tell me if it is. But getting into the L-arginine pathway and the nitrite,
Well, I think
nitric
it is
oxide.
because you can't really address the issue surrounding nitric oxide deficiency if you don't understand and appreciate how the body makes it and then what goes
Right.
wrong in people that can't make it.
So why don't you give
I
us
think-
sort of a high level on those two pathways that?
Yeah, so the first pathway, and this goes back to the late 70s, early 80s, that was recognized that arginine is required in cell culture media to make nitric oxide, to activate soluble guanylate cyclase, to lead to vasodilation. And so that really elucidated this biochemical pathway of arginine, nitric oxide synthase, make nitric oxide gas, and L-citrulline as a byproduct. But it's the function of the NOS enzyme, as we mentioned, that leads to that deficiency. And then the other pathway, which is a redundant and kind of compensatory pathway, really maybe not a compensatory pathway, but certainly a redundant pathway. Because there's enormous redundancy in physiology, and that's how resilient the human body is. But this other pathway is really, it's not an age-related decline. It's really a lifestyle-related decline. Because we recognize that the foods we eat, and this primarily comes from green leafy vegetables, contain inorganic nitrate. So when we consume these vegetables, it's concentrated, it's reabsorbed in our kidneys, it's concentrated in our salivary glands. So now when we salivate, we're secreting nitrate. And under normal conditions, there's what we call nitrate-reducing bacteria on the crypts of the tongue, and this is part of the oral microbiome.
Mm-hmm.
And then when we swallow, so these bacteria convert nitrate to nitrite. This is a 2-electron reduction that humans don't have the capacity to do. So we're 100% dependent upon the bacteria. And now we swallow our saliva, we get a burst of nitric oxide gas in the lumen of the stomach, provided that our stomach can make hydrochloric acid. And so now that we understand these very important pathways that lead to nitric oxide production in the lumen of the stomach, then diet becomes an important factor. We do, people who eat a standard American diet, or what we call the SAD diet, do not get enough nitrate from their diet. The other problem is this whole hygienic hypothesis of disease. 2 out of 3 Americans use mouthwash every day. Most people have fluoride in their toothpaste and in their drinking water. Fluoride is an antiseptic. Obviously, mouthwash is antiseptic, and it's killing the good bacteria along with the bad guys. And then, we have 200 million prescriptions written for proton pump inhibitors every year and antacids. And that's not even counting that you don't even have to have a prescription to have these drugs anymore. You can go to the local drugstore, or Walmart, or CVS and buy, Prevacid, Prilosec, Nexium, omeprazole over the counter.
You're pretty much naming things that I keep cringing, because I'm like, well, let's see, what do I brush? I got to make sure my teeth are nice. And then I've had acid reflux my entire life, and being an otolaryngologist in the past, now
we have really indisputable data that we and others have published on that if you use mouthwash, you eradicate the oral microbiome, and we see an increase in blood pressure.
So what
the protective benefits of exercise?
So let's in terms of just understanding sort of what we should be doing there when you're talking about the oral cavity. Just brushing your teeth with normal toothpaste is fine, right? Because you're not necessarily killing the natural microbiome there, or is there some other thing that we should be doing?
No, I think that's right. So the entire microbiome has been mapped. The gut microbiome, the oral microbiome, the dermal microbiome, the vaginal microbiome. So we have a clear, really picture into the microbiome. And these bacteria, most of them are symbionts, meaning that it's a symbiotic relationship between the bacteria and the human host. And these bacteria are doing things that we as humans can't do. So if you go back 100 years ago, there was this first recognition that oral pathogens can cause systemic disease. And that started in dental medicine. So now it's clear the oral systemic link. People with periodontal disease, gingivitis have a higher incidence of heart attack, stroke, really all cause cardiovascular mortality.
And Alzheimer's too, right? You've got
Alzheimer's. And 50 years ago, the dental community started, well, if you got gingival plaque, let's throw an atomic bomb in there, give you chlorhexidine, or put Listerine or alcohol-based or chemical-based antiseptics, and let's eradicate the bad guys. Well, 50 years ago, maybe that was a good idea, but now we've come so far and understand that they're commensal bacteria, non-pathogenic bacteria that live in our mouth and on our body that are essential to human health. we now know nobody in their right mind would take an antibiotic every day for the rest of their life because of the havoc it causes systemic disease by destroying the gut microbiome. We're doing the same thing by using fluoride and by using antiseptic mouthwash.
How?
So I think the balance here
Mhm.
is making sure that we kind of manage the gingival kind of pathogenic bacteria. But what the data are telling us is that we have to support the oral microbiome. We cannot eradicate it and destroy it, which is what fluoride does, what antiseptic mouthwash does.
How do you support it? Because I mean, obviously, people talk about gut health all the time, and you've got
Yeah.
probiotics and all that. What do you do for oral flora, especially if you've already been using mouthwash for years? You've probably destroyed it. So how do you restore that?
Well, the good news is, and we published on this in 2019, 4 days after you stop using mouthwash, you completely repopulate and restore the normal flora.
Huh?
So the good news is that these bacteria are pretty resilient. No matter how you never get 100% kill of the bacteria. I think there's a reason for that because it would probably be lethal. We're
Yeah,
so dependent on the bacteria.
but that's good
So
news.
you can eradicate them, but within 4 days of stopping using mouthwash, we see a repopulation of this. And interestingly, you can start to see a normalization of blood pressure within 4 days.
I guess there's so many people on proton pump inhibitors. I mean, what's and they're on them because a lot of people really need them. So what do you do there?
Well, I think if you want to survive and not have heart attack, stroke, and Alzheimer's, you have to figure out a way to get on these
You're
because
either
now, if you
constantly
go
in
back,
heartburn or you actually have a heart attack. So those are your choices.
that's right. Yeah, I prefer the former. No, the issue was that data now show that people have been on PPIs for 3 to 5 years. This dates back to continuous research. 40% higher incidence of heart attack, stroke, and late last year, there was a report showing that people have been on PPIs for 3 years had a 40% higher incidence of Alzheimer's.
Oh, wow.
So these are all vascular diseases because it's shutting down nitric oxide production, restricting blood flow, leading to vascular inflammation, focal ischemia, plaque instability, and plaque rupture, and insulin resistance, which is what happens in Alzheimer's. So these drugs were never approved for chronic use, right? If you go back 30 years ago, the only FDA trials on proton pump inhibitors for acute gastroesophageal reflux disease was a week or 10 days. These were approved for acute management of acid reflux. There were never any long-term studies done on these. Now there are, and it's deadly. So what I tell people is really reflux is a symptom of insufficient stomach acid production. Because if you need stomach acid to break down proteins into amino acids, because the human body is never designed to absorb foreign proteins, right? We see those as antigens and we develop antibodies against them. So if you eat a protein-rich meal and you don't have stomach acid, you can't generate trypsin, which then cleaves the proteins into amino acids. So you get these peptide fragments that your body sees as foreign, and your body tries to expectorate it or get it out of the body, and that's acid reflux. It's trying to get these undigested protein and peptide fragments out of your body because they're seen as foreign, and that's reflux.
So,
So reflux is a symptom of insufficient stomach acid. Giving
huh.
a proton pump or an antacid makes no sense physiologically. The other major problem which leads to reflux is you have to go back to your basic biochemistry. For pyloric cells in the gastric mucosal to make stomach acid, we need iodine, we need zinc, we need sodium chloride, we need sodium bicarbonate. And so if you don't make stomach acid, you can't absorb zinc. 95% of Americans are deficient in iodine. So we don't even have the raw materials to absorb these nutrients. I mean, without stomach acid, you can't absorb iron, selenium, chromium, magnesium. And again, most Americans are deficient in this because they're not able to make stomach acid.
So let me ask you this: how do you raise your nitric oxide bypassing the gut? I mean, are we talking about Cialis, and what kinds of things can we do, or are we not there yet?
Well, the drugs like Cialis, these PD-5 inhibitors they potentiate nitric oxide signaling, right? They do nothing to affect nitric oxide production. So the way these drugs work is they inhibit an enzyme called phosphodiesterase. So nitric oxide is produced, activates a second messenger called cyclic GMP. Phosphodiesterase enzymes break down cyclic GMP. So if you can inhibit phosphodiesterase activity, you can lead to an accumulation of cyclic GMP. But without nitric oxide being produced first, there is no cyclic GMP.
So they work by, they essentially allow nitric oxide to build up, and not break down. Is that
It's not nitric oxide that's building up, it's cyclic GMP that
okay?
builds up. And that's the second messenger that leads to smooth muscle calcium mobilization and relaxation.
Okay.
So without nitric oxide, PD5 inhibitors don't work. And that's why 50% of the men that are prescribed these drugs for ED or symptoms of BPH don't respond. It's because they're so deficient in nitric oxide, there's no activation of the second messenger system, and PD5 inhibitors have no substrate to work on.
Is there any other pharmaceutical way of raising nitric oxide?
I mean, we're working on that through our company called Bryan Therapeutics. We're working on FDA-approved drugs, but we make an orally disintegrating tablet that it's a lozenge you put in your mouth and it dissolves over 5 to 6 minutes. And as that matrix is falling apart, we're liberating about 20 to 30 parts per million nitric oxide gas. So this is the same. I mean, as a surgeon,
Yeah, it's
that when
for
you
angina.
give,
Yeah.
yeah, for angina or for pulmonary hypertension in neonates or adults, you give nitric oxide gas at 20 to 30, sometimes 40 parts per million inhalative NO therapy. And that's the exact amount of nitric oxide we're delivering through this ODT.
So
And so we can bypass, if you're on antacids, we bypass that. If you have endothelial dysfunction, we bypass that. So if your body can't make nitric oxide, we do it for you.
it's fascinating. Is that something that's available right now?
We've got a consumer products division under the brand N101.com. But our drug program is still under development. We got a drug, we're in phase 3 now for ischemic heart disease. We're seeing that we're just as good as isosorbide without the tolerance development or the tachyphylaxis. So it's a vasodilator. It dilates, obstructive ischemic coronary arteries. We've got a drug for Alzheimer's, which improves insulin signaling, improves cerebral blood flow, prevents protein misfolding. And we also make a topical drug for diabetic ulcers and non-healing wounds. But all of these products, we have a consumer line of products
Yeah.
that are available today.
Is the drug that you've got, is it much different from the nitric acid, the angina drug?
Yeah, so the drugs like isosorbide, dinitrate, and nitroglycerin, these are called organic nitrates, and it's a completely different mechanism of metabolism. So these drugs have to be metabolized primarily by mitochondrial enzymes to cleave this nitroester bond to release the nitro group. Then that leads to activation of guanylyl cyclase and vasodilation. But as you know, these drugs, people develop tolerance to them. In
Yeah.
fact, isosorbide dinitrate, for example, if you give a patient a dose, you get pretty good vasodilation, acute symptomatic relief of the angina. But you dose them 12 hours later, you get a 50% attenuated response. So there's tolerance, what we call tachyphylaxis. What we do is completely different. We're not dependent upon mitochondrial enzymes. We use natural product chemistry to release nitric oxide in the mouth through this orally disintegrating tablet. You're still generating nitric oxide gas, leading to vasodilation, but there's no tolerance development. In fact, we're improving endothelial function, improving the body's ability to make it.
So I assume that you probably, when the drug is probably indicated for people with angina then, right? It's actually providing a better drug than nitroglycerin.
Well, I think that's, for us, that's what we call the low-hanging fruit. I
yeah.
mean, because it's a very simple trial. It's a very simple endpoint. Organic nitrates have been used for hundreds of years now, back to the days of Alfred Nobel. But yeah, so we see vasodilation. In fact, we see even plaque regression in patients with obstructive coronary ischemic heart disease.
Interesting. And the side effects wise on something like that, nitroglycerin, people who take nitroglycerin sometimes get some pretty bad headaches, that kind of thing. Is there something that you can do to mitigate that element?
Well, no, with our drug delivery system with this ODT, you don't see the cerebral vasodilation and the increase in intracranial pressures and the cerebral headaches that you see with nitroglycerin. So this is a more controlled, sustained release, and it's probably dose dependent. But the levels that we're putting on the market today, either as a dietary supplement or as a drug therapy, we don't see the vasodilation. We don't see the increase in headaches. And we've actually done this in pregnant mothers with preeclampsia, where we measure the intracranial pressures and give them the nitric oxide to normalize their blood pressure to extend gestation. But the problem in preeclampsia is a lot of times you see an increase in intracranial pressure and initiate seizures, and then you've got a crisis on your hands.
Did you mention that there was actually some supplements that are currently available that you guys do for this? Or
Yeah, I developed this solid dose form of nitric oxide gas many years ago, and this was done when I was on faculty at University of Texas Health Science Center in Houston. We made a number of discoveries, but yeah, we make an orally disintegrating tablets called N101. It's registered as a dietary supplement, but these have been on the market for many years. But we're taking that same delivery technology, making it more potent for drug therapy for specific indications.
yeah,
So it's similar to, Lavazza, right, which is a fish oil that has an FDA indication for hyperlipidemia or hyper elevated triglycerides. It's just fish oil, right?
yeah,
You can go buy over-the-counter fish oil, or you can go buy the more pure
yeah,
FDA drug form, and we're going to use the same approach and same precedents. We make nitric oxide in a way that's supplementing what's missing as a dietary supplement, and we're going to make drug therapy that's more potent for specific indications, because what I need to take kind of prophylactically as a dietary supplement is much different than someone with ischemic heart disease with 90% stenosis or obstruction would need to open a coronary artery and lead to
right.
plaque regression.
Well, and
We're titrating in different doses for different indications.
the supplement itself, if it's oral, I assume that you run into the same problem with the gut, right?
No, because we published a paper in 2007 showing that nitric oxide is a hormone, and that completely changed the way we think about delivering nitric oxide. And so if you think back, and it's actually pretty simple, the science is pretty complex, but the solution is pretty simple. And it's hormone replacement therapy, right? In
Yeah.
older men that can't make testosterone, what do? We give them testosterone,
right,
right? At levels that recapitulate normal production and normal signaling. But we don't have to give testosterone as shots into the testes, right? We can give
Yeah.
it transdermally, we can give it sublingually, we can give it intramuscularly. So that because it's a hormone, it has endocrine effects. So just like with nitric oxide being a hormone, we can deliver it in the oral cavity. It goes systemic and it has endocrine effects. So all we got to do is just deliver a certain amount of nitric oxide over a certain period of time, similar to testosterone, similar to estrogen, similar to T3 or active thyroid, and it does its job. So that's the trick for us, was how do we deliver the right amount of nitric oxide over the right period of time in the right biological compartment? And that's what the ODT does, the oral disintegrating tablet.
yeah, yeah, fascinating. Well, yeah, I mean, just before we leave that topic, people are probably wondering what that supplement. Where do you get that supplement? Is that something you can order on Amazon, or is there?
Yeah, we have an
website?
Amazon store. We've got an e-com site called n101.com. It's letter N, the number one, the letter O, number one.com. So it's one nitrogen, one oxygen, which is nitric oxide, n101.com.
So, wondering about some other applications or some other nitric oxide based interventions. Things come to mind. Have you, certainly like in long COVID, vascular inflammation issues. Is that something that you've looked into?
Yeah, we have. We actually had a drug in phase 3 clinical trials during COVID. We got our IND, which is an investigational drug application, approved in June of 2020. We got our IRB approved in November. We had drug manufactured, I think, by late October. And we started treating COVID patients in early December of 2021. And so, yeah, what we found was, and we had data going back to 2005, that nitric oxide actually prevented or inhibited coronavirus replication. This was SARS-CoV-1, but SARS-CoV-2, there's clear evidence that nitric oxide, and that's how our own innate immune system prevents us from getting sick from viruses, whether it's RSV or COVID or any coronavirus, that we mobilize our immune system, we generate a lot of nitric oxide and prevent that virus from replicating and propagating throughout the body. So that's our initial defense. So what we recognized early on in 2020 was that the people who were getting sick and dying from COVID were the people who couldn't make nitric oxide, the elderly, the hypertensive, previous heart attack, diabetics, people in nursing homes, hemodialysis patients. Those people can't make nitric oxide, and it's the root cause of their illness. So our whole thought process was, well, let's give nitric oxide as an early intervention within 72 hours of onset of symptoms or a rapid or positive diagnosis, and we can prevent the loss of oxygen saturation, the hypoxemia. We could prevent the virus from replicating and propagating throughout the body. And then more importantly, we had data to show that we could downregulate the ACE2 receptor, the primary target of binding of the spike protein. So here's the scenario. In people who are nitric oxide deficient, they've got an upregulation of the ACE2 receptor. They can't mobilize an immune response.
Yeah.
So when they get exposed to the virus has multiple targets to stick to the ACE2 receptor. They have poor circulation, so they can't mobilize an immune response. And this virus just takes over, spike protein being produced. They get vascular inflammation, clot formation. That's long COVID.
Yeah.
And they lose blood oxygen saturation. So if you can make nitric oxide, our body recognizes when there's a virus that attaches, it mobilizes an immune response, generates nitric oxide, kills the virus, shuts down, downregulates the ACE2 receptor, so there's no target for the spike protein to bind to. And that's been me for, we had 26 clinical sites during 2020 through 2023 all over the US. I was in a COVID clinic every week. I didn't wear a mask and I've never had COVID.
Yeah.
It's not that I wasn't exposed to it, just my body deals with it. And I haven't been sick from a viral infection in more than 25 years.
Yeah.
And yet I'm on an airplane every week for the past 15 years of my life, traveling all over the world.
And what do you take those supplements?
Absolutely. I do a lot of things.
Yeah. Well, I do too. So I'm like taking notes right now.
Yeah, no, look, it's very hard to, it's hard work staying healthy, but it's harder work if you're sick trying to get healthy. So if I'm going to spend a lot of time and effort and hard work, I want to be preventative and proactive instead of reactive.
So the next thing I want to talk about, it's sort of a selfish thing because, I noticed that you have some, you've done some, written a little bit on MTHFR. So I have so there's this gene, just so people know, it's the MTHFR gene. Part of what what ends up happening is if you have mutations in there, you end up producing more homocysteine, and that leads to a number of issues, increasing the risk of cardiovascular disease, even Alzheimer's disease, et cetera. But it's easy to fix in that, if you take a methylfolate supplement, sometimes the problem's gone, and that's what I do. Now, this affects like 30% of the population.
Yeah.
So it's no joke. I mean, it's like people walking around with this. So how does the MTHFR gene polymorphism affect nitric oxide synthesis? And I guess, what strategies can be employed to optimize nitric oxide production in that situation?
Yeah, there's some papers that show 45 to 50% of the American population have either a heterozygous or homozygous SNP or single nucleotide polymorphism, that gene. So in biochemistry, there's a shuttling of metabolites from one chemical reaction to another, right? So the methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase feeds in, it's a methylation issue, but it's actually the enzyme that reduces biopterin to tetrahydrobiopterin. And so if this enzyme isn't functional, then you get more oxidation of tetrahydrobiopterin, which then leads to NOS uncoupling, which then leads to nitric oxide deficiency. So in the MTHFR patients, they're almost by definition nitric oxide deficient because they're unable to recycle and reduce biopterin tetrahydrobiopterin. And we published this in 2009, that it's this redox ratio, a certain ratio of BH4 to BH2 that determines NOS uncoupling. And so if you have more oxidized form of tetrahydrobiopterin, then there's a disruption in the flow of electrons and you can't make nitric oxide. But if we can maintain that redox balance and taking methylfolate and or using other kind of antioxidants that have a specific redox potential to reduce biopterin tetrahydrobiopterin, that requires a certain electrical potential, then we can overcome MTHFR deficiency and still lead to adequate nitric oxide production. We're not fixing the underlying genetic issue. We're compensating for that by understanding the physical chemistry of that reaction.
Another reason for me to be on some kind of nitric oxide replacement. This might have saved my life here, this interview. I mean, there's just so much I could go through, but I may be missing some things that you think are particularly important of the certain topics.
I think the big ones for me are obviously cardiovascular disease, still the number one killer of men and women worldwide, despite billions of dollars in research. And, we all know what leads to cardiovascular disease. It's fat deposition, it's vascular inflammation, it's inflammation, oxidative stress, and immune dysfunction. And so nitric oxide prevents, downregulates, and mitigates the inflammation, prevents the oxidative stress, and inhibits the immune dysfunction that you see in cardiovascular disease. And so, again, hypertension or high blood pressure is the number one risk factor for development of cardiovascular disease. If you can't make nitric oxide, you develop high blood pressure, and then you get plaque instability, plaque rupture, and that's a heart attack or ischemic stroke, depending on what vascular bed that is.
Yeah.
So nitric oxide is absolutely essential for preventing the onset and progression. And now we have data showing we can even reverse it. So in patients with stable plaque in the carotids we treat them twice a day for 6 months, we see about 11% plaque regression in their carotid arteries. And so, that's just an easily visible
Yeah, that's crazy.
artery, but the same thing happens in your coronaries or any other major arteries.
Yeah.
And that's also important for Alzheimer's. The earliest stages of Alzheimer's are what we call vascular dementia. It's a vascular problem, right? Through SPECT scans and functional MRIs, we can see a focal ischemia or parts of the brain that are hypoperfused. So the small vessel disease, the small blood vessels are clamped down and constricted, chronically constricted, and you're not delivering blood flow. And you develop insulin resistance. And I think we published in 2010, 2011 that nitric oxide is part of insulin signaling. So again, if you can't make nitric oxide, what leads to cardiovascular disease? What leads to Alzheimer's? All those risk factors that lead to an accelerated progression of disease are all risk factors associated with nitric oxide deficiency. So if you can't make nitric oxide, you can't dilate blood vessels, you develop metabolic disease, insulin resistance. If you can't deliver oxygen and nutrients to cells, you get protein misfolding, you can't take out the waste product, and that's amyloid plaque and tau tangles.
Can you have too much nitric oxide? Basically, what I mean is, say you're taking supplements or whatnot, and we've already drawn an analogy here between hormones, and obviously with testosterone, you absolutely can. You can overdo it. But is there a self-regulating mechanism that prevents that from happening?
There's only 2 signs of toxicity for nitric oxide. One is hypotension, too much vasodilation, you lose perfusion pressure, and you get orthostatic hypotension and lightheadedness, and worst case scenario, you'll pass out because of loss of perfusion pressure. And then the other is methemoglobinemia. Too much will oxidize the hemoglobin or the iron in hemoglobin and lead to cyanosis and a condition called methemoglobinemia. But you will lose perfusion pressure long before you see any clinical symptoms of methemoglobinemia. So the beauty of how we deliver this nitric oxide is if you have normal or low blood pressure, when you take the product as indicated, then you don't see a further reduction in blood pressure. We've done 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure. For instance, I'm always kind of the N=1 guinea pig. And if I do a 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure, my blood pressure is typically about 118/68. I take a lozenge, it doesn't drop my pressure. And we published in 2011, we had a kid in the pediatric intensive care unit with a blood pressure of 15-year-old kid, 210/115. And we dosed him with the lozenge. 4 hours later, his blood pressure was 130/80.
This is the over-the-counter stuff, or is this the?
This is just the over-the-counter supplement. But we had to dose him every 4 hours to manage that blood pressure, a rare urea cycle disorder that led to resistant hypertension. But we monitored his methemoglobin formation. There was no detectable increase in met formation. So what we're finding is even in a 15-year-old pediatric patient with a rare genetic disorder, 1 lozenge as a dietary supplement every 4 hours is completely safe in managing blood pressure with no methemoglobin formation. So that's kind of our, based on published clinical, kind of in a controlled environment, monitored by 5 different physicians from a pediatric nephrologist, cardiologist, GP, geneticist, and a whole room full of docs.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because I've been sort of knee deep in all of the longevity stuff, and I don't hear much about nitric oxide. It's really not something even with cardiovascular disease. Typically, we think of right now the current thought with a lot of even the forward-thinking cardiologists is really you've got 2 things. You've got high ApoB and you've got inflammation. The combination of those 2 results in atherosclerosis, but it sounds like there's other elements here, like nitric oxide, which we don't really talk about.
Well, I think nitric oxide is the holy grail for cardiovascular disease. Number 1, cholesterol doesn't cause heart disease. Targeting cholesterol is, I think, being the biggest myth that's ever been perpetuated in medical sciences. Yeah, inflammation is a driver. Several of my patents are on a method of reducing inflammation by C-reactive protein. And mechanistically, we know how to do that. I think the ApoB, the lipoprotein particles, are, transporting protein or cholesterol and fats and lipids. So there can be a perturbation in that if you have some, ApoB SNPs or some genetic predispositions to that.
Well, is there a position so? I guess just going back to this idea that maybe it's you're not a believer in the cholesterol element of this. I mean, if you look at like Mendelian randomization studies, it's pretty clear there is a direct correlation between LDL elevated LDL and cardiovascular disease. Are you suggesting maybe that's more downstream to what the actual cause is?
Phenomenon. I think it's not causal. If you and originally the target for statins have changed over the past 30 years. Originally, it was inhibiting. I mean, these drugs work through inhibiting the HMA-CoA reductase enzyme, the cholesterol synthesis pathway, the rate-limiting step. And if you look at the American Heart Association predicted when statins were first approved and brought to market that it would eradicate cardiovascular disease by the turn of the century. And if you just look, all we do is look at the numbers. Let's look at the facts.
Right.
The number of PCIs from 1986 to 92, there was about 1,700 percutaneous coronary interventions, or what we coronary interventions. That number has gone up. So for the 6 years after that, it went up. From 2017 to 2018, there were over 6,000 PCIs in the U.S. So if cholesterol caused heart disease, and they want to put statins in the drinking water, getting everybody's cholesterol below 200, but yet the incidence of heart disease and cardiovascular disease isn't going down, it's going up, and the number of interventions are going up, that proves right there, just the facts alone, that targeting cholesterol is having no effect. In fact, I think it's making things worse. We need cholesterol. Cholesterol makes up our cell membrane. It makes up our brain. It's causing diabetes. They're mitochondrial toxicants causing cancer. They're causing Alzheimer's. These are the elevation in LDL. Again, if you target LDL, which now they're trying to do through different strategies, it's had no effect on the rate or progression of fatal heart attacks, sudden cardiac death, PCIs, progression of cardiovascular disease. It's the wrong target.
Well, I think there's two elements. I mean, I don't know that you and I necessarily agree completely on this, because I do think that I think a lot of it is really related to metabolic disease. And
Absolutely. I agree on that.
And LDL, LDL cholesterol elevation is downstream typically of metabolic syndrome. And I think metabolic syndrome is going up a great deal. And
well, I would argue that it's the triglycerides that are the enemy. That's a more accurate readout of metabolic dysfunction.
Well, they make up ApoB as well, right? So ApoB is in that. And so I think that I think the way I read this data is that there's the high ApoB levels are, in my view, necessary but not sufficient to create atherosclerotic plaques, and then you need inflammation, and then maybe there's an element of that lack of nitric oxide there as well. So there's probably multiple sources there.
No, I think so. I think we demonstrated this in a 2008 paper that you can completely inhibit the microvascular inflammation you see in the earliest stages of cardiovascular disease simply by restoring nitric oxide production. You downregulate the adhesion molecules, you prevent monocytes and neutrophils from sticking to the lining of the blood vessel, you prevent the extravasation, you prevent the oxidative stress and the immune dysfunction. So nitric oxide alone completely inhibits the earliest stages of vascular inflammation.
Yeah. And that would knock out essentially your inciting point, sort of the throwing the match on the gasoline, so to speak.
That's right.
Right? Anyway, listen, this has been a really fascinating conversation. I learned a ton, and I really do appreciate your time. Just once again, how can people learn more about your work, and give us again a little bit of a rundown on where we can look up some of your supplements?
Well, you hit the nail on the head earlier when you said that not a lot of people know about nitric oxide. So my primary objective and mission is to educate and inform. I've created my own YouTube channel, Dr. Nathan S. Bryan, Nitric Oxide, where we post interviews, podcasts, just some scientific information. I spent 20 years in the basic sciences, published over 100 peer-reviewed scientific articles. So I like to think that I understand the basic sciences. And so I want to put the real science out there in a way that's digestible so people can, make these simple lifestyle changes and consider if you have resistant hypertension and are using mouthwash or fluoride. What we're finding is I tell people, get rid of your mouthwash, get rid of your fluoride, come back 30 days later, and we see that their blood pressure is normal for the first time in sometimes decades. And now we can see, I think for the first time in modern medicine, we talk about how do we wean patients off of drugs and not putting them on more drugs. Let's restore the physiology and not always implicate pharmacology and giving synthetic inhibitors of biochemical reactions. So YouTube channel. I've got an educational website called Dr. Nathan S. Bryan. I do a monthly blog there. I've got several books out. I got a new book out coming out later this fall and early summer or early winter called The Secret of Nitric Oxide, Bringing Nitric Oxide to Life, where I really recount my 30 years in science and the discoveries we made and talk about how important nitric oxide is. So be on the lookout for that.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks again for joining me.
Thank you for having me. Been a joy.
Thanks for listening to Sapio with Buck Joffrey. A quick reminder that while I am, in fact, a surgeon, nothing I say should be construed as medical advice. Now, make sure to include your physician in any medical decisions you make. And also, if you're enjoying the show, please make sure to show your support with a like, share, or subscribe. Until next time, this is Buck Joffrey for Sapio with Buck Joffrey.